Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This evening, we're here with Ayasoma and Bhante Jagaro, and we're going to be having a Sangha panel discussion on identities. And our source text that we're using for this discussion is the Vāsettha Sutta, which is found in the Sutta Nipata in chapter 3, Sutta number 9. It's also found in the Majjhima Nikaya, though I don't remember the number in the Majjhima Nikaya off the top of my head. And it's a bit longer than we really have time to go through in full detail, so we'll be focusing on a particular section of this discourse. But to start with a general overview of where this is coming from. So in the sutta, there are students of a famous Brahmin. So these were practitioners of what would have been a scholastic branch of one of the predecessors of Hinduism. So one of the proto-Hindu schools of thought at the time. And they are having a debate about what is it that makes someone a Brahmin. So the term Brahmin means someone who has the highest degree of spirituality, which there were many different ideas about what makes somebody a spiritual person. So they were having a debate about what defines a Brahmin, what defines somebody as being spiritually perfect. And since they can't agree, they go to ask the Buddha, which is also interesting because in theory they're not Buddhists, but still they go to ask the Buddha's opinions about these things. Because as it says in the sutta, there was a good reputation for the Buddha. The Buddha had a reputation as being a incredible spiritual master. So even though he wasn't from their particular religious tradition, they still went to get his opinion. And so they tell him that we've been having this argument about what defines a Brahmin, what defines a spiritual master. Is it based upon their birth? Like if you're born in a family of spiritual people, a family of Brahmins, does that mean you inherit the spiritual perfection of your parents? Or is it something that you do during your life? Is it something that you cultivate and develop during your life? So they come to ask the Buddha what the Buddha's opinion on this is. And then the Buddha gives an answer. And the Buddha's answer is, he starts off by talking about how you can identify the difference between different classes of beings based upon their birth, based upon their physical characteristics. But the clinchpin of the sutta is when he goes into talking about humans. When he goes, and this is what's most directly relevant to our conversation today. So maybe we can start by, I'll read through this section from the Buddha where he talks about the distinctions between beings, and then we'll have some conversation from that point. So again, this is from the Vāsettha Sutta, Sutta Nipata, chapter 3, Sutta number 9. And this is the Buddha speaking to these two Brahmin students. So first, the Buddha says, Vasetha, so that's the name of the student he's talking to. He says, Vasetha, I will explain to you, sequentially and accurately, an analysis of the distinctions in birth among beings. He says, know the grass and the trees, although they make no claim. Birth has produced their distinctive characteristics, and by birth they are different from each other. So he's starting off here with insentient things, with plants. Grass and trees we can see are very different from each other. And he says, then the moths, butterflies, ants, and termites. Birth has produced their distinctive characteristics, and by birth they are different from each other. So here are different species of insects. He says, know the four-legged beings, both small and large. Birth has produced their distinctive characteristics, and by birth they are different from each other. So cats and dogs and cows and horses and donkeys and all those beings, again, we can see that these species are very different from each other. He says, know those who move on their stomachs, long-backed snakes. Birth has produced their distinctive characteristics, and by birth they are different from each other. Know the fish and all those who live in water. Birth has produced their distinctive characteristics, and by birth they are different from each other. Know the birds and all the winged beings who fly through the sky. Birth has produced their distinctive characteristics, and by birth they are different from each other. He says, in this way we see that their differences are produced by birth, but among humans there is no difference produced by birth. So here the Buddha, he's gone through animals and spoken about how the different species of animals can be seen to be born distinctly different from each other. But he makes this critical statement: among humans, there is no difference produced by birth. And he says, not by the hair or the head, not by the ears or the eyes, not by the mouth or the nose, not by the lips or the eyebrows, not by the throat or the shoulders, not by the stomach or the back, not by the buttocks or the chest, not by the anus or the genitals, not by the hands or the feet, not by the fingers or the nails, not by the knees of the thighs, not by the color or the voice. There is no difference produced by birth, as it is with other beings. In human bodies, no discrimination can be found. Different human types are spoken of by designation alone. In other words, we come up with arbitrary names for different kinds of humans, but the Buddhist point here is that ultimately all humans are just humans. So it's not like the difference between a snake and a bird, or a difference between a cat and a cow, but rather we talk about different kinds of humans, and these are just names that we put on things that are not inherently different from each other. Again, you'll notice in the characteristics that the Buddha is going through, one of the key ones that he points to is genitals. So how do we distinguish male bodies from female bodies? Well, the Buddha is saying, well, okay, you can talk about differences in genitalia shape, but ultimately this is a meaningless distinction. It's just something that we arbitrarily put a name on. And then he goes on about how we actually go about naming humans. He says, among humans, no one who makes a living by herding cattle as a farmer, Vasetha, not a Brahmin. So somebody who does farming, we call them a farmer. It says, among humans, no one who makes a living by crafting as a craftsman, Vasetha, not a Brahmin. No one who makes a living by trading as a merchant, not a Brahmin. No one who makes a living by serving others as a servant, not a Brahmin. No one who makes a living by stealing as a thief, not a Brahmin. No one who makes a living by archery as a warrior, not a Brahmin. Now, this next one is interesting. No one who makes a living by priesthood as a priest, not a Brahmin. So here the Buddha is making a distinction between priests and Brahmins, which is also an interesting point here. And next he says, I do not call one a Brahmin based on a mother's womb, nor is one called a Brahmin if one possesses anything. But one who has nothing and attaches to nothing, that one I call a Brahmin. And at this point, then the Buddha goes through a fairly long and detailed description of a fully awakened being, in which the Buddha is clearly stating that what really makes somebody a Brahmin is when they perform spiritual practices which purify the mind, perform spiritual practices which remove greed, hatred, and delusion. And this includes many things which he goes through, including non-attachment, virtue, morality, concentration, wisdom. He goes through many, many ways of defining, again, an arhat, a fully awakened being. But in all of this, he's using the term Brahmin when referring to an awakened being. So again, the Buddha is taking this stance here that, and he sums this up towards the end of the sutta, so I'll read this section as well. He says, it is not by birth that one is a Brahmin. It is not by birth that one is not a Brahmin. So in other words, it's not the characteristics that one has when one is born as a human. It's not those characteristics that make one either spiritual or non-spiritual. It's not, one's spiritual capacities is not determined by what kind of body one has at birth, or what family one is born in, or what social stratum one is born into. Instead, he says, by action one is a Brahmin, and by action one is not a Brahmin. So one's spiritual status is something which one chooses based upon the actions and choices that one makes in life. And he goes on, he says, one is a farmer by action, one is a craftsman by action, one is a merchant by action, one is a servant by action, one is a thief by action, One is a warrior by action. One is a priest by action. One is a ruler by action. The world goes by actions. The populace goes by action. Beings are bound to their actions, like the axle on which a wheel moves. By means of austerity, spiritual conduct, self-restraint, and training. By means of this, one is a Brahmin. This is the ultimate Brahmin. So here again, the Buddha is emphasizing that it's ultimately the decisions and actions that we take, that we do with our life, that either increase our spiritual qualities that lead towards complete perfection, or conversely diminish our spiritual capacities and bring us away from awakening. So that's a brief summary of the sutta and a read-through of a couple of the really critical sections. At this time, I'd like to invite my monastic companions to say a few words, what your thoughts are on this particular discourse. Whichever one of you would like to go first, please.
Thank you, Bhante, for that beautiful introduction to the sutta. This is one of my favorite suttas. So as the more you were talking about Vāsettha Sutta, I was smiling and smiling with Dhammasuka. And I feel like it's such a profound discourse where the Buddha, first and foremost, somewhat introduces to us how actually we naturally relate to other sentient beings. So, for example, cats, you have now Teddy, our foster monastic cat. I don't know if our friends online can see him, but there's a little cat. And usually, for example, the people that have come lately at Empty Cloud Monastery, as soon as they see Teddy, the first question that they ask is Teddy a girl or a boy? And so it's not immediately evident. There's not one sort of obvious characteristic, even though actually it can be pretty obvious with Teddy, but for those who have seen it, but still not that apparently obvious to immediately identify sort of the sentient being in that kind of way that we tend to do with humans that are closer to essentially the form that we are used to. And also in terms of colors, we don't tend to think of like, orange cats have this particular sort of characteristic, or black cats are this particular characteristic that is, this personality that is radically different, or this skill set, they're particularly good at catching mice, for example, than, like white cats or whatever it is. Like we just tend to think of them, well, they're cats and they have these sort of tendencies of mind. And there's this black cat and this white cat and this gray cat. And then, of course, there are actually artificial breeds of cats that are complete, total, actually human fabrication to develop sort of specific traits. But actually, there's not an inherent either dogs or cats do not come in particular breeds. They're actually human fabrications once again. And other things that come to mind is also like the foxes that sometimes come here. And, each one of us sometimes refers to the fox as a she, sometimes as a he, sometimes as a they. And in fact, actually, it's they would be quite accurate, because we have no idea. There's not anything that is really essentially that we can immediately identify. And with foxes, even color actually is kind of like, they all kind of pretty much look the same. They all have kind of like the same markings. And so it's very easy, as the Buddha is pointing out, to kind of classify other sentient beings based on essentially, some like sort of main characteristic that they all kind of share of birth. But the closer it gets to us when it's humans, the more instead we are very, very particular. We start, very much, I look at this room, everybody around here, and I'm like, yeah, nobody's Italian here. But actually, to the average, for example, American, I look like a Caucasian American, whatever that means. So actually, there's a different sort of interpretation even within this room of who is who, where, like, how do we belong, what are these kind of main characteristics, and so forth. And then, of course, that gets segmented even more so in terms of, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of social status, in terms of like all the different, for example, clothing that we're wearing, the different elements, the different characteristics, the different haircuts. Here, we clearly are a bit of a more of a blank state. But when we go about in the world, 2 days ago, we were in New York City. There is very much, actually, even we put it, even an extra effort, contrarily to cats. Cats don't seem to be too concerned in kind of trying to express one particular characteristic that defines them, that makes them different from other cats. They don't wear clothing in a particular way. They don't sort of cut their groom their fur in a particular way to distinguish themselves from others. But in the human realm, it seems that we both distinguish others, and we also try to distinguish ourselves from others. So there's this constant subdivision of people in our mind, and we tend to then start believing that there is actually an inherent sort of an essence to these characteristics that we identify or that we highlight in each one of us, and that these characteristics have a solidity, that these characteristics really mean something, and that perhaps certain people who have certain characteristics are innately good at one particular perhaps job, or innately good at one particular place in society, or innately good at perhaps spiritual practice, or they're innately bad at spiritual practice, and so forth. And so it's interesting how the Buddha kind of essentially shifts the paradigm from all these sort of ideas that we have of the world, ideas that we have of ourselves and others, and instead places the emphasis on what are we doing, what are the actions that actually are instead very important. And so if we want to actually be, if we are concerned with purity, rather than thinking I am a pure person, or I'm an impure person, or that person is impure, or that person is pure, is rather what are the actions of purity that need to be done, and kind of focusing a little bit in a different, putting a little bit of a different perspective on this. So this is what comes to mind.
Great.
And we'll jog it on.
When Bhante asked if I had read this sutta, and I said I don't think I have, but when you read through it, I was like, oh, this jogged a memory, and I think I did come across it at some point long ago. The thing that I think kind of struck me is a few different things. Probably first was the Buddha. I've noticed in many suttas, including this one, he's always using a lot of skill of meeting the audience and where they're at. So in this context, I got the impression that there are these students that are arguing about basically who's the best, or who's the real Brahmin, and it kind of reminded me of, I don't know, well, maybe modern discussions. People be arguing who's the best basketball player ever, right? You'll hear people that are basketball fans arguing about this, or who's the fastest, the best runner ever. You might think of like, oh, but what about this runner that back in the day, if he had access to the modern equipment, could he all that kind of stuff. People really love talking about who's the best at sports, or who's the best at politician, or who's the best whatever. And so in this case, the Buddha is basically really kind of taking that obsession with kind of like that kind of obsession with who's the best, or in the obsession around they're probably looking at characteristics like, oh, if a Brahmin is somebody who has, these physical characteristics, or these, and really kind of focusing on something that's probably was very different. I think it was a Buddhist historian, Richard Gombrich, actually saying that the Buddha and his emphasis on karma with respect, and that actually what determines rebirth. In other words, what we do is an action, and that it's not like, what you're sacrificing and, things like that. But that was actually quite a revolutionary shift in thinking. Like, this wasn't like, we may take it for granted these days, but I believe he was saying that in his opinion, this was actually quite a revolutionary shift. And so to me, that was another thing that they reminded me, that we might take this much more for granted these days, that kind of looking at people based on the value of what they do. But it may have actually been quite a new idea, much more newer idea back then, a much less sort of generally accepted idea back then. Again, I don't know. I wasn't there back then, or maybe I was. Who knows? That was other thing that kind of really struck me. That again, this Buddha had a lot of skill, and also that this might have actually been quite a new concept. And I guess the other thing that just other came to my mind just based on what the other venerals were talking about. But yeah, people love. Well, maybe love is maybe a strong word, but yeah, they're obsessed with like subdividing people and separating people. These people are over there, and these people do this, and these people, those people do this, but us people do that. All that kind of stuff, which is ultimately at the root of well, my sort of view on this. It seems like a big root of a lot of things that lead to discriminatory behavior of one kind or another. A lot of this sort of, us versus them kind of thinking, or, this sort of distinctions, right? Like our minds are, for example, are really good. Like when we're looking in the room, like imagine if it was an alien looking at this room, right? I'm just guessing an alien might like pick out our clothing maybe as like the biggest, kind of distinction, but we're often like really wired to looking at like faces, or like you mentioned, like kind of maybe the color of our, and these are or the color of our hairs, or, these are very particular kind of distinctions, right? Again, like when I look at when I look at different cats, I can't really tell what difference between one's bigger and smaller, and, I like, but the cats, I'm sure like one's really attractive and one's really like ugly or something, I'm like, I can't tell the difference what's ugly or, beautiful being cats, and they all look kind of the same to me, but for cats, they can really, figure this stuff out, but humans are very similar, right? We have like these really, we can really hone in on these, taking these really minor things and making them really big distinctions, right? And so, the Buddha is really, I think, really kind of hammering on that tendency that we have. We take these very small distinctions and just make them huge when they're quite almost insignificant. So.
Yeah, and I think that the real central point that Buddha is aiming at here is he's talking about the capacity for spiritual development of a person. So at the time of the Buddha, there was already emerging this idea that the Brahmins were innately more spiritual than everybody else in society. This idea that the Brahmins had a higher capacity for spiritual development than everybody else in society, and were just naturally more spiritual than everybody else. Just naturally, they were closer to Brahma. They were closer to divinity. They were more godlike than everybody else, all the other kinds of humans. And so what the Buddha is pointing to here in the sutta is he's constantly coming back to the point that it doesn't actually matter what kind of human you're born as. Every single kind of human has the same capacity for developing spiritual qualities, for developing divine states of mind, for making progress towards awakening. And that any distinction of saying like, well, this group of people is more likely to attain awakening than those group of people, or these people of this gender are more likely to attain awakening than people of that gender, or this race is more likely to attain awakening than that race, or people from this country than that country, or this culture than that culture. The Buddha is saying that all of that is actually completely irrelevant. So no matter what kind of body or what kind of culture or what kind of family that somebody is born into, if they put forth the actions which produce spiritual development, then they can become fully awakened. They can actually reach the highest state of spiritual development, the state of complete awakening. And one minor point that I do want to point out in this discourse, so just linguistically, so towards the end where the Buddha is saying, one is by action, one is a Brahmin, by action, one is not a Brahmin, one is a farmer by action, one is a craftsman by action, and so on. The word that's being translated as action in Pali is kamma. And so this is the word karma, which is pervasive in modern usage. But it's important to understand that when the Buddha is talking about karma, he's talking about choices that we're making. So intentional actions of body, speech, and mind. So deliberate choices. And those choices then are what shapes the development of our mind and the development of our experience. So he's saying that if we make choices that are pointed towards awakening, then we will become more awakened, more spiritually perfected. And if we make choices of, again, if we make choices of stealing a lot of stuff, then we'll get really good at stealing stuff and we'll be a master thief. Or if we focus on combat, then we'll get really good at combat and we'll be a master soldier. But more important is, if we focus on practicing spiritual development, then we'll get really good at that. And we can possibly even become the best of the best. We can become the world champions at spirituality, which is the arhats, the fully awakened beings. So any other comments? Any venerables want to add some more comments on the sutta?
Yeah, another thing that, thank you, Bantes. Another thing that comes to mind, based on also what Venerable Jagaro had mentioned, sort of our tendency of othering others, but it's also of othering ourselves. So us versus them, but also us versus us. And so also the way that we actually relate to our potential of awakening. So usually, especially in Buddhist circles, we have so many different theories, actually, since Bhante mentioned karma. There's lots of sort of ideas that essentially by birth we are more, we have more of an inclination towards awakening or not, or we have, in a lot of Buddhist countries, unfortunately, that there is the fake news of it's bad karma to be born a woman, for example, which, by the way, it's nowhere present in the Pali Canon. The only thing that is kind of close to that is actually what is said by Mara, not hint, to Bhikkhuni Soma, from whom I get my name from, who somewhat tries to insinuate that doubt in Bhikkhuni Soma, who was an Arhat. So clearly was like, yeah, talk to my hand. What does womanhood have anything to do at all when the mind is concentrated well and sees right through Dhamma? Yeah, has nothing to do with that. But yeah, there's so many interesting things that we can, interesting in like an interesting sort of quote unquote way where we can approach, it's really interesting, especially in the West. There's we have imported, for example, it's bad karma to be a woman. I've heard it mentioned by many people who are not born Buddhist or not born in Asia. And it's also very interesting here in America. We hear a lot of times like, it's also bad karma to be born a person of color. And I remember thinking, quite doubt that, the Ajahns in Thailand or the Bantes in Sri Lanka, think that way. And so we can have like all these sort of assumptions of what it means, what is actually, we use these terms like it's good karma to be born with this particular form, or it's bad karma to be born in this other form, in a very superficial way that is dependently arisen based on our delusions of the place. And this is also true in different parts of Asia as well. It's kind of very interesting. Here you can hear usually what is I've heard defined as very good karma is to be born like a white male. And actually the sort of the average Tibetan will have a very sort of different perception, actually. Maybe the male part, they can get on board, but yeah, if you're really not Tibetan, it's just bad karma, full stop. It's kind of good luck, everyone who is not Tibetan. Maybe if you're Asian, a little bit better, but definitely if you're not Asian, really, really, really bad karma. And there's also that sense in Chinese culture as well. If one goes to Taiwan, you know, if you're not Chinese, I mean, it's kind of cute that you're practicing Buddhism. But yeah, not really the best karmic conditions. So we see that all of these ideas on what is by birth essentially a good karmic condition is really just the product of so much greed, hatred, and delusion, essentially, that is not really substantial. And I feel like the Buddha is inviting us to look at that, to not essentially construct a conceit of superiority or inferiority based on our conditions of birth, but rather focus on what are we doing right here, right now. What are we cultivating with our mind? What are we practicing in terms of Dhamma? And really focusing on doing good karma rather than speculating on whatever karmic condition we've had.
Thank you, Venerable. I was actually thinking about what you said in the last sentence. I was reflecting on just that. Since that's it was a very nice segue. I'm often puzzled sometimes when I listen to just the kind of average American when they talk about karma, or even Buddhists sometimes when they talk about karma, because it seems quite, while there is a little bit of overlap in terms of how they use karma, it seems to be quite different. So like for example, when they say it's good karma to be this or bad karma, like what you're saying, it's, wait a minute, you're right now you're doing the karma speculation, right? And also you also seem to be talking about something you don't know about. So, or like at least it doesn't have that kind of feeling of somebody who's spent a lot of time studying the Pali Canon, right? So there's when the Buddha, at least what I've read of the Buddha talking about, karma, it's, very much related to, like I said, actions, what we're doing now, and that has a result of vipaka in the here and now, which can be immediate, sometime in the present life, or in the next life, the upcoming lives. And so it has a very different, to me at least, it has a very different feeling as opposed to the way that people often use karma, kind of like, it almost feels like when people are talking about karma, like, oh, it's good karma to be this or bad karma to be that, it's almost like they're just they're using as an explanatory balm to kind of cover the world. Like the world has all these things that happen, right, that are hard to understand, and so like as a way of trying to understand it, they just immediately go to the karma bag and go, okay, it must be this, and again, I mean, I don't know, maybe it is true that like I won the lottery because of good karma in the past life, or I don't know, people say things like that. It also, what it seems to also do is it kind of detracts, I think, from what the main point of when the Buddha is talking about karma, what the venerables are really good at pointing out, is what we're doing right now. So as I'm talking right now, like, oh, what's going on in my mind? You know, like, is there like wholesome or skillful motivations going on, and like, you know, and then like, are there unwholesome or unskillful motivations going on? And then trying to, you know, keep tabs on that and be very careful about whatever we're doing. You know, one of the things I really appreciate about Ajahn Brahmali's visit, especially his talk last night, it really, like, I know I've heard this before, but it really hit home about the importance of not just keeping good sila or really good sila. I think he used like super duper super you know, good sila, because, you know, and it's like, I was thinking in my mind, it's like, yeah, like a lot of times during the day, like I noticed just, you know, the last, you know, it was like that day, it was like, I am keeping sila, maybe in body and mostly in speech, but yeah, and often in minds, I was like, you know, I'm often just getting grumpy and irritated. I'm like, you know, I was like, you know, that's, you know, okay, I can work on that. You know, that's something I need to raise that level up to, like, to super duper super, you know, comment. It's like, it's all these things, whether it's my body, speech, or mind, in order to, you know, develop that result of happiness and well-being, that's going to be incumbent on me, right? That nobody else can help me. I mean, well, they can encourage me, right? But they can't, it's going to be up to me to do those actions. So I have to find some way of really trying to curtail this kind of grumpy nature that I have, and find a way, like, okay, you know, okay, grumpy, kind of irritated, okay. And like, okay, but that's going to lead to unpleasant results. And so that's what the karma that Buddha was talking about. So it kind of, you know, it's one. So I feel like the kind of standard way that often people talk about karma, again, you know, maybe it is useful to some extent. I think it in a lot of ways detracts from what I think the main point that the Buddha was talking about karma is. What are we doing right now in the here and now? Is it skillful? Is it unskillful? Is it wholesome or unwholesome?
Yeah, and coming again to this theme of the karma of spiritual practice in particular. So what comes to mind is, for example, if for the past week, so the past several days, one had been spending several hours every day practicing meditation, minimizing one's speech, minimizing one's thoughts, minimizing any kind of distraction, then all of that is making kamma, which means as a result, today, it will be very easy to enter samadhi, to practice meditation today. So then today you sit down and you're like, oh, meditation is easy, samadhi is easy. It must be because I was born as a white male. That must be why. But actually, it's because for the previous 7 days, I've been doing a lot of work to, work is another translation of the word kamma, by the way. I've been doing a lot of work to create the supportive conditions in my mind. And actually, if Ayasoma spent the same amount of time creating the same conditions, then she would have a similar effect. And same for Venerable Jagaro or anybody else. So it doesn't have anything to do with what kind of body one has, whether one is short or tall or light or dark or male or female or any of that. But it has to do with what work we've put into creating supportive conditions. On the other hand, if I spent the last 7 days listening to heavy metal music and watching movies and playing video games and talking about football with Joe and Daniel, and then if I try to meditate today, it's going to be quite challenging. And I'll think like, oh, this is my bad karma for being born a white male. This is clearly, it's the karmic retribution from past lives, but there's nothing I can do about it. It's just karma, and this is my fate that I have to endure because of my bad karma. When actually it's just because I've been making bad karma the last 7 days by making actions that are messing up my samadhi. So again, I think this is what the Buddha is really pointing to here. It actually, to be born as someone with a male body or a female body or a light-skinned body or a dark-skinned body or a body in Nigeria or a body in Argentina or a body in Britain or a body in Germany or wherever, it really doesn't matter. What matters is what effort have we been making to cultivate the conditions for the growth of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. So where we actually can see a distinction then is, for example, if somebody spent a couple of lifetimes doing a lot of meditation practice, then in this life, they might find Samadhi pretty easy. And they might find other excuses for why, but ultimately the reason why is because they've been developing that skill for many lifetimes. And it doesn't have anything to do with being born in a particular country or in a particular body or a particular family or any of that, but it's just the effects of the work that they'd been doing in the past. But then one can easily come to other conclusions, and where this is especially harmful, so this kind of misinterpretation of karma. Example we commonly use is the caste system in India. So where there can be this pervasive idea of like, oh, well, Joe was born in the untouchable caste, so he's hopeless. It's his own fault that he got there, and there's no hope for him. So we're just going to treat him like dirt because, I mean, it's his own fault anyway. And well, good luck, Joe. Better luck next life. And I'm really not that funny, though I appreciate the compliment. But then the problem is that because I'm treating Joe like dirt, then I'm actually creating bad karma. And it's bad karma, which is going to both damage my spiritual growth in this life and also likely to create unpleasant conditions for me in future lives. Whereas actually, if Joe is taking the opportunity in this life to cultivate spiritual qualities, then he'll make progress on the path in this life, and he's also likely to have more supportive conditions in future lives. So this also is an example of how the concept of karma can be misused. It can be misused as an excuse to neglect people in unfortunate conditions, or possibly even to worsen those conditions for people who are already having a hard time. We then pile on an extra layer of mistreatment and say, well, it's their fault for their bad karma. But actually, it's us who are just generating more bad karma. So this also is something that needs to be kept in mind, is that even if somebody else is experiencing misfortune because of past life bad karma, that's no excuse for us to look down upon them or to mistreat them. In fact, that's all the more reason for us to do what we can to support them and to help create supportive conditions. So recognizing that everybody has the capacity to make good karma and bad karma. And regardless of what conditions we're born into, the important thing is, what are we doing with those conditions? So to try to hold down people who are already down, and that's just generating phenomenally bad karma for ourselves. And it's based upon wrong view. So performing unwholesome actions based upon wrong view, the Buddha says these are the conditions for rebirth in hell. So bad news. For all those who say that women have a hard time attaining awakening, better be careful about your next life there, friends.
Good luck, everybody.
Yeah. Anyway, those are some thoughts I wanted to add to the conversation. And we have a few questions starting to back up. But is there any other comments before we start looking at questions?
No.
Okay. So first off, hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Still Subject to Clinging. Hello to Joel. That name always seems to get a laugh.
It's great.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
That's a good name. Hello to John, Maria, Bhumika. Well, the problem is when one day they'll change their screen name to No Longer Subject to Clinging.
Oh, dude, I'm
Yeah.
delighted.
Hello also to John, Maria, Bhumika, Kobe, Janaki, Metta, Kumu, Yankee, Manal, Chandrani, Yin Tun, Jayas, Lely, Jane, Olga, Van, Karuna, Kui, Putrika, Ben, and Jeff. Welcome to all of you. Glad to see all of you joining in. And there's actually a couple kind of off-topic questions. So still subject to clinging says, since the topic is identities, would each of you explain the meanings of your Ayan Bhante names and how they were given / chosen, etc.? It's not exactly what we were talking about. So maybe this would be better for Mug Chat. Yeah, stay for Mug Chat. So still subject to clinging, you can bring this to Mug Chat tomorrow evening and we'll answer it then. Also, Joel is asking what our favorite Dhamma books are. I mean, well, it's the Pali Canon. I mean, if I had to pick one, it's always a toss-up between the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, and the Anguttara Nikaya. It's kind of hard to pick a favorite between those three.
It's like you give between your children.
Yeah, exactly.
Not your.
I mean, I don't have any children, so that one's a bit easier. Yeah, again, this is more of a monk chat question, not quite on the topic here. Favorite Dhamma book? Same. Okay, favorite Dhamma book?
Well, I actually do of the Pali Canon, probably the Sutta Nipata.
Oh.
Yeah,
because there's so much. I'm not really a poetic person, but it's very moving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also appropriate since this was from the Sutta Nipata tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, you actually did say that. Sorry, I didn't know that, but I forgot it. Yeah.
And Joel is apologizing for calling me Yutta Dhammo. I'm actually not offended. I'm just amused because in my mind we don't look anything alike. So I know there are other opinions on this matter, but in my mind we don't look much alike. For one thing, he doesn't have glasses.
He does, Bhante. Anyway,
He got laser eye surgery. He doesn't wear glasses anymore.
There's a bit of a joke at I remember, so Bhante Siddhasa and I ordained at a Bayagiri, and I remember a number of people would come to the monastery and they would say, oh, can you tell, this monk, I forgot his name, and just, can you pass this message on? And be like, well, which monk is it? Can you describe him? He's like, they're tall and skinny and they have glasses and
that describes about 80% of the community.
Yeah, it doesn't help.
So Manal asks, this one actually is on topic. How does good karma from our previous lives inherently affect our identity in this life? I suppose identity and identifiers are often self-prescribed, so this is tricky to grasp. Ayasoma, do you have comments? Looks like you have thoughts on
Yes. Well, I feel like in Buddhism in general, we are a little bit too obsessed with past and future lives in the sense of like the kind of sort of nominal previous lives that we don't remember and the possible future lives that we have in the sort of what we call after death. But fundamentally, I feel like there's this process of birth and death is kind of constantly happening. And if we actually look at our experience right now, we've, personally, I've had multiple lives in within this life. And so there's been obviously lots of karma that has been done within this life and vipaka in terms of result of karma that actually can be really seen. The direct, essentially, cause and consequence that creates the condition that I'm experiencing right now. There's also a lot of question marks, but there's a lot of answers. For example, even just something really worldly, like the tendency of the mind to look at the mark of the beautiful. It's not something that actually I had as soon as I was bored and I was like obsessed with pretty things. To a certain degree, maybe very slightly, but it was actually something that was highly developed as an adult through the choices that I decided to make professionally. So I literally trained my mind for about 15 years, nonstop, intensely, to look at forms, look at shapes, put forms and shapes together, criticize forms and shapes that others have put together. I was really good at that. And essentially define one as superior or inferior than the other, and delighting in those beautiful forms. So clearly, yes, there was maybe already that tendency from the past. That's probably, you can say, maybe you can speculate and you can say, oh, maybe that's why Ayasoma was born in Italy, where clearly, apparently, there's like a whole culture obsessed with sort of developing. It's a very sensual culture. It's a culture that, emphasize so much every possible kind of iteration of sensual pleasures, both in terms of like eating, like all the different types of food and combinations of it. I remember going with actually Bhante Sudaso and some other Dharma friends to Italy, and I was the only Italian, and I had to explain the menu. And the menu, like I still remember, they were all like significantly different things on the menu. This was my perception, but they all had like very specific Italian names. And they were asking me, so what is this? And I was like, okay, well, this is, pasta with tomato, basil, and mozzarella. And this is, what is this? And this is, well, wheat with, this time the tomato is raw instead of cooked. Mozzarella has been treated in this other type of way. There's still basil. And then there's other thing. Basically, everything was, kind of variation on wheat, tomato, basil, and mozzarella. And it just occurred to me basically how something that was essentially the same thing had looked just previous moments ago like something radically different one from the other. And it's the same thing, you look at buildings in Rome. Actually, there was a stratification of like centuries of all these like beautiful forms juxtaposed one over the other. It's ridiculous. So everything is somewhat conducive to this cultivation of the mark of the beautiful. So maybe you can say there was already that tendency of mine that perhaps created the conditions for that rebirth. But then there was definitely different actions that were made, which I can highlight, which create the conditions that even though today I do nothing that is related to that, there is still that mind that tends to look at things and delight in things. And so there's obviously that vipaka, that inclination that creates what we call ayasoma today, ayasoma that delights in, particular shape of a building rather than the other, or a particular statue made in one shape or the other. And there's also the action that's being done every day that creates new vipaka. So the condition is radically different. I don't know if this makes sense, and if I can't speak English too well today. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have anything on that?
I don't. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think if someone develops a strong identity, so a strong identity is fundamentally, it's a habitual mental activity. So that habit definitely can carry over from life to life. So actually one example of this is that if somebody is, over the course of many lifetimes, if they, for example, have a very strong male identity, and then they're born in a life where this time around they happen to biologically have a female body, but they might still have a very strong male identity from all of those, having had that mental activity over the course of many lifetimes. So they may still have a very strong male identity, whatever that might mean for any particular person, which doesn't quite match the current biological body that they're inhabiting. Or similarly, somebody might have a very strong identity with certain physical activities, which again might not be quite possible for them with the body they wind up with. Maybe somebody was very athletic for many lifetimes, but then this time around they have a body that is physically weak or handicapped in some way. or mental activities. Somebody might have cultivated certain intellectual propensities over many lifetimes, but this time around it's not accessible to them. So there may be this sense of like really wanting to study and learn, but it just isn't available to them, or it isn't accessible. So these are all things where, yeah, the identities that we develop in past lives can also create kind of a baseline for identity in this life. But it's all subject to change because it's dependent upon continual reinforcement. So one might have a very strong identity lingering from past lives, but where we go with it in this life is ultimately a choice that we make. And it's important not to get into judging this, especially not in other people, but even in ourselves, not judging it, but rather asking, how can I use the conditions that I have in order to make progress towards awakening? And I think this is actually one of the main points the Buddha is making in the Vāsettha Sutta, is he's continually pointing back to the fact that we can always, regardless of what conditions we start with in this life, we can always make choices which point us towards spiritual perfection, which bring us in the direction of awakening. So those are just a few thoughts. Anything?
Excellent. I think
Okay.
it's good.
And Janaki has a linguistic question. So Janaki says, I think that complexion or skin color meant in Buddhism is not black, white, brown, yellow, or golden, but a pleasing and radiant color. In blessings, we often hear, Ayuvan no sukhang balang, long life, healthy complexion, health, etc. Isn't that so? It's a result of good karma. So the word vanna in Pali actually has several different meanings. So one of the meanings is, in fact, complexion, as you're talking about. Vanna can also mean beauty, physical beauty. Vanna can also mean color in a literal sense of white, yellow, green, blue, orange, purple, and so on. Vanna can also mean social stratum or caste. So Vanna, it actually has quite a range of meanings, and one of them actually literally is the physical color of something, which also can literally mean skin color. And also it can mean social caste or again, the four Vannas of Hinduism is the four castes. That's the word that's used for the castes. But it does also mean complexion, as you're mentioning here. That's one of its several meanings. So with words that have many different meanings, the context must be taken into consideration in order to understand which of those many meanings is intended. And actually selecting the wrong meaning from the many meanings of a word can often lead to terrible misunderstandings. So that also needs to be understood.
Just one fun fact on this theme of color. Actually, Mahamoggallana and Uppalavanna are actually usually depicted in iconography purple, I believe, right? Blue, dark blue. Yeah. But in reality, it's because actually they had skin so dark, so black, that it has the reflection of the color blue, like the blue lotus, essentially. So there's lots of different ideas. Once again, here we can do so much speculation on skin color. We can it just really also varies, but we can believe it so much when we are part of one culture. Actually, a lot of friends were talking about like going to Africa and some of the people there getting completely freaked out when they saw a so-called white person because they thought it was a ghost that was coming around. It was really freaky. And or just a demon. So there's lots of different assumptions that we can have towards either physical traits that we are not used to, or physical traits that we put a meaning towards it. But those physical traits are just essentially neutral. There's nothing to it. And it's very dependently arisen, the kind of sort of attribution, the qualification that we give it to it, which is why we should just refrain from speculating whether having one particular skin tone or one particular set of genitalia is good or bad karma. It's just completely arbitrary.
Okay, thank you. And still subject to clinging says, we have a limited understanding. Karma as a word seems to be used as a shorthand word. We need to hear the words used appropriately. Adding the words for effects would improve. The word you're thinking of is probably vipaka. So the Buddha speaks about kamma as an action that one takes, and vipaka as the effect or result of that action. So sometimes we use it as a compound, kamma vipaka, as meaning action and result, similar to the phrase cause and effect in English. But I think actually the real problem is not karma being used as shorthand, but rather that often when people say karma, they're talking about it more like fate or destiny or an unchangeable condition, and that doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. So that interpretation of karma seems to be quite clearly contrary to the Buddha's teachings. Joe, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm interested if this is on topic. The concept of a pugala, Arya pugala, like an individual. So an arahant can still be labeled an individual. And there's a story of like one of the arahants who was constantly calling people outcasts. Like, and people complained about his speech, like he would call everyone an outcast. And the Buddha said that he was completely enlightened. So I guess he doesn't have to change that personality or characteristic. Or I know other monks talk about like someone who was very rude, but he had been a fishmonger for many lifetimes. So that's just the way he spoke. And that's something about, does that resonate with you at all? Does that seem relevant to the conversation about being a personality? Like, what's the difference between personality and like being an individual, having a personality?
Well, I mean, first off, in the case of that particular arahant, that story is commentarial. As far as I'm aware, it's not actually from the suttas, it's from the Apocrypha. So anything apocryphal is to be taken with a handful of salt. But the example of someone who, say, they speak in a coarse or unrefined way, well, actually, I would point to the Arnavabanga Sutta, where the Buddha says not to get too hung up on the specific words that people use, but rather try to understand what they mean. So, for example, we had this issue earlier where the term free will was being used, but there was some misunderstanding. So different people thought the word meant different things, and that leads to conflict. So the Arnavabanga Sutta is the analysis of non-conflict. And the Buddha says one of the critical elements of non-conflict is when somebody speaks, don't get hung up on what specific words they choose, but rather try to understand what they mean by what they're saying and respond to what they mean. So somebody might speak in a very rough and coarse way, but they may have a heart of gold and there's not the slightest trace of malice or aversion or hostility. And that's just the kind of communication that they've learned. And that's just how they talk. And so rather than saying like, you need to wash your mouth out with soap, young man, instead it's like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I hear you. Okay, let's talk about this. Rather than just like saying someone like, you need to go back to school and use a dictionary. It's like, well, okay, I'm going to try to understand what you mean rather than criticizing the words you're choosing. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Do you have any comments?
There's a pattern in the Vibhanga, the stories of the monastic rules and the things around them. And one of the things that happens, the Buddha does this in this explanatory stories that led to these different rules that got passed down, is that often a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni breaks the rule, the Buddha, they get sent to the Buddha calls them, and Buddha asks, so-and-so, did you do this, or this is what happened, did you do that? Or did you say this? And there's something very nice about that, because presumably the Buddha, according to the Pali Canon, had the ability to read minds. So why would he ask? And so I don't, people have different ideas. I have no idea, what other people think, but my read on it was, he's trying to model good behavior. He's trying to give people an opportunity to acknowledge what they're doing, right? So there's two parts: is giving a person a chance to kind of reflect on what they're doing, and also modeling that good behavior of actually inquiring, is this what you mean, or what are you actually doing? What are you trying to say when you say this? Because I know for myself, I can have an idea what people are thinking, but really it's just a guess based off experience, and quite often it's maybe not totally incorrect, but could be missing lots of things, or I might be misinterpreting things, or I might not have the whole story. So it's often very useful and very beneficial to engage with people and say, oh, this is what I've heard you say, or this is what, can you tell me what's going on? Like, and this is a way of actually engaging with people in a respectful way, engaging with actually finding out the story, not presuming that we know everything about what's going on. I think, and of course I will, add the caveat, there is a unfortunate reality that sometimes people can be quite, what's what I'm looking for, incredibly deluded or incredibly dishonest, or maybe a combination of both. And so we might have a relationship with somebody where we try to, engage with them in an honest and respectful way, and we're, just kind of constantly coming away with just confused, and like their words don't match up with their actions. And we might just have, at a certain point, have to try to make, our best, assessment of what to do in these situations. But putting those kind of situations aside, it's always good, from my experience, to always try to ask people, is this what you said? Is this what you meant? Or what did you mean by when you said this? To actually have a kind of respectful inquiry and not make assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And we have some more questions from online. So Ben asks, would the Buddha reject the idea that being born a white male in a society that advantages that particular group has anything to do with karma? Ayasoma, what are your thoughts?
Well, I feel like there's, so all of these questions are pretty loaded because they come with a lot of assumptions that, like, what are we talking about in terms of advantages a particular group? So what is exactly, like, you might say, oh, it's good karma, once again, to be a white male in the United States of America. Is it really? Like, in what kind of context? I mean, from what I've heard, I'm not American, but it seems to me that there's a lot of emotional repression. I'm not sure I would want to. I don't think that's really like good karma, I've quite, like, if I cry, apparently there's not that big of a deal. But the average American white male seems to have that sort of conditioning, and it's very difficult. So when it comes to spiritual practice, that can actually be a big obstacle. Also, having a male body, I've heard that testosterone, for example, provokes a lot of strong sexual urges that are a little bit different than having to deal with estrogen or whatever kind of hormone that this kind of body has to deal with. Do I want to really sign up for that? I mean, that's also like the number one disrobing reason for bhikkhus. For bhikkhunis, not really. So so this is what I'm saying. Like, there's like so many different assumptions. Is it because all the Krubajans tend to have a male body? All the most famous bhikkhus, male monastics are male. Well, if you read in the Pali Canon, what is actually an obstacle for awakening? Honor, praise, gain, bitter, vile, obstructive to awakening. So if you have this body, very difficult to have praise, honor, gain, bitter, vile, obstructive to awakening. So it's really good karma. So this is, yeah, if you want to be perhaps a corrupted politician, then yeah, great to have a male body. If you want to be, you know, a wrestler and like beat up people, yeah, great, come. I don't know. So what is it essentially that we are valuing? What is our perspective? So I feel like that's why the Buddha doesn't really talk about it in those terms, but rather, yeah, really focuses on our spiritual qualities and essentially what do we need to do, what do we need to develop, and yeah, and by action we become a Brahmin.
I think in freestyle wrestling, actually, they have both male and female, and judo, and what are the other big MMA? It's quite popular.
So it's equally bad karma.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Says, thank you so much for clarifying that the canon has no basis for racism, misogyny, or homophobia. I've heard that wrong teaching for years and was always so uncomfortable with it. Yeah, so this is actually one of the things that it's a little bit uncomfortable, which is that just because a place is labeled as teaching Buddhism doesn't necessarily mean that everything that's said is exactly in accordance with the Buddha's teachings. So yeah, you will sometimes hear Buddhist teachers who say things which are racist, misogynist, or homophobic. But that doesn't mean that's what the Buddha taught. It just means that's what that particular teacher is teaching. And when we go back and we look at the Pali Suttas, what we find is the overwhelming message throughout the suttas is, as demonstrated here in the Vāsettha Sutta. So the Vāsettha Sutta is not some rare outlier. It's actually representing themes which run throughout the entire Pali Canon. So one has to really, really hunt to try to find anything in the suttas which even comes close to supporting racist, misogynist, or homophobic opinions. But if one is interested in non-racism, non-misogyny, and non-homophobia, well, actually, you have 99.999% of the Pali Canon on your side. So there's not really a problem here. Skeptic, just carrying on with this, Skeptic says, what about the passages in the four Nikayas which talk negatively about women? Well, there's about 2 of those in the entire Pali Canon, and scholars universally agree that these were apocryphal additions and very clumsily added apocryphal additions because they do stand so starkly opposite to everything else the Buddha said. So it's kind of like if you have 999 passages where the Buddha says the ocean is salty, and then you have one passage where it claims the Buddha said the ocean is sugary. Well, why does everybody keep going around saying the ocean is sugary? Isn't it more likely that something got a little bit wrong with the transmission of that particular sutta? Isn't that a more likely conclusion?
Regarding the previous question,
which one?
The one that just before.
This one?
Yeah.
Or this one?
So much. No, next one.
This one?
The next question. The next thing.
This bit?
Heard that teaching. Yeah, I heard that teaching for many years. So where? I'm just curious where. I mean, I'm not trying to like call people out per se. It's just more of like.
You mean names?
No, I guess what I'm trying to say are these Buddhist monastics? Are these like particular traditions? I mean, I don't know. Maybe just people here can give a sense because I mean, I'm just curious. Is it?
Unfortunately, wrong view is pretty pervasive.
Yeah, I think there's obviously the mythology that it's bad karma to be a woman. That's pervasive in Buddhist circles, East and West. Then there's certain ideas that it's a breach of the precept of no sexual misconduct to have, for example, homosexual relationships and so forth. And this was an import of actually colonization in Asia that then has been absorbed by the different forms of Buddhism. So then all of these sort of assumptions get somewhat shared and perpetrated. So I think this is what Van is referring to. If you're referring to something else, Van, you can feel free to talk about it. But that's what normally that has been my experience.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, by the way, as far as the advantages of being a white male, actually, if you're interested in practicing Chinese Buddhism, the ideal conditions are with the body of a Chinese woman, because then you can go to Taiwan, and there are about 85% of the monasteries in Taiwan are, 1, in Chinese, 2, occupied by Chinese people, 3, only for women. So actually, there are certain areas of the Buddhist world where to be a white male is a tremendous obstacle rather than a support. Anyway, so there's, well, we actually already answered this. So Skeptic says, if I'm part of an ethnic minority which has to deal with discrimination, is it because I created bad karma in past life? You had actually already answered that in a previous question.
Yeah, I think it's just important, though, to, like clarify that each one of us has been essentially been around without discoverable beginning. Hence, we've been both, Mother Teresa di Calcutta. And if you don't like Mother Teresa of Calcutta, imagine a saint, pure, like really good, good-hearted, replace it with that, all the way to Hitler. And so clearly all of these actions have created some results, and some results need to be also taken. How do you say?
Lived out?
Lived out. Thank you very much. Yes. So we can go on endless speculations, I feel, on like, why are we experiencing what are we experiencing? And I feel it's not really useful. I mean, we can understand, I think it's good to understand that essentially we are capable of making actions that lead to good results, but not to speculate too much on what have I done in the past. Actually, in the Vāsettha Sutta, the Buddha says precisely not to do that, not to go into that line of thinking. Who was I in the past? What did I do, to deserve this? What will happen to me in the future? Who am I? Blah, 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 blah. But rather, we can acknowledge, actually, I think we can focus on what we can clearly see in this moment. So, for example, if we are the ones discriminated, or if we are discriminating on someone, there is an action that is clearly akusala. So that we can say discrimination is akusala. So I feel like the focus should not be on the person who's discriminated, but the focus should be on highlighting how the action of discrimination is akusala. The action of discrimination is a bad action. That we can all agree on. That is something that we actually can acknowledge. All of the rest is a bunch of speculation of why that person is here, there. Like, there's so much stuff that I don't think it's worth really putting too much reflection on. And Joe has another question.
I'm curious if the Buddha ever said anything about slavery.
Yeah, so the Buddha said that trading in sentient beings is wrong livelihood. So that's one example. So buying and selling human beings would be a very clear example of misconduct, of unwholesome conduct. Yeah, so that's one very clear example.
Are there any famous disciples who were slaves?
There are many who were former slaves who then became monastics. Yeah, there's some examples of that.
Ethan?
Yeah, I don't know if this is relevant, but it's just been on my mind. It's related to some of the questions, so I thought it's just more of a comment. But I remember in Ian Stevenson's research on rebirth, there was a boy who was born in Burma, Myanmar, to Burmese parents, and he had white skin, red hair, like eye shapes that were unusual for that condition, and had past lives related to that kind of identity. And so it seems like what related to what you were saying, but it's also about continually identifying as I'm a male, or I'm this and that. It seems related to skin. It seems unrelated to his. If it's just speculation still, but it seems like one example of how his skin tone is completely irrelevant to bad karma as much as it seems just identity and past just habitual action or something. So I don't know if that's a relevant comment.
Great. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Daniel has a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's also a comment. I just want to say that speculating for me about like what culture I've been from in the past has been entirely fruitless and entirely unhelpful, and has led to an increase in a sense of identity. As a child, I thought, I had a lot of inclination toward all Japanese things, and I had no knowledge whatsoever of anything Japanese, but I thought for sure the Japanese people were the coolest in the world, with no knowledge of why I thought that. And yet, do I think that I was Japanese in my past life? No, I have no reason to think that, and it's fruitless for me to think about that and identify with that.
Yeah, I mean that's what the Buddha is pointing to in the Vāsettha Sutta, as Ayasoma was pointing out. So when we like build up the stories of like, in my past life, I was a Japanese samurai who did a da 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 da. Well, we're just reinforcing this story of me, this attachment to the story of me.
I don't even have any interest in all things Japanese at all anymore. I don't identify with that at all.
Okay, and we have a couple more questions online, so let's try to get through these last couple of questions. So Cameron asks, is the karma vipaka different based on circumstances when the action is taken? For example, stealing a loaf of bread when your family is starving versus stealing a loaf of bread for fun. Yes, yes, absolutely, it is different. So remember the Buddha said karma is intention. So the motivations and attitudes underlying an action make a tremendous difference. So for example, stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family. So there is an unwholesome component, which is the intention to steal something that doesn't belong to you, belongs to somebody else. So the intention to steal is, of course, unwholesome. But the intention to feed your family is wholesome. So that would be an example of mixed karma. Whereas if you steal the loaf of bread because you hate the shopkeeper and you want the shopkeeper's business to suffer, then that would be much more unwholesome. There's nothing wholesome about that at all. So that would be mostly or exclusively unwholesome karma, bad karma. So yes, absolutely, there is such a thing as mixed karma. And actually most of the actions that we take in our lives are most likely mixed karma. So some kind of shade of gray. So we're trying to make the shade of gray as light as possible. But yeah, it's sometimes situations get a bit murky, but we always try to be as exclusively wholesome as we can. Anything else?
I've been actually reflecting on this theme of this question, primarily around I was trying to think of like contexts of let's say somebody attacking you, or somebody attacking somebody you're taking care of, like your child, right? And let's say there's a kind of a what do you do in response to these sort of things, and what do you do when you feel like it's basically you either respond with like the only other response you can imagine is doing something unwholesome. Something like, for example, like killing somebody or killing a being. And, I don't have any sort of brilliant responses to these situations, other than that. To me, this is actually one of the things that led, when I started thinking about these questions as a layperson, it was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue monasticism and also take up like the practice of Buddhism very seriously, because I started to recognize that you're inevitably going to be put into situations if you live in, you take a body, some kind of body, even the best of circumstances, you might get put into a situation where your choices like different shades of, dark shades of karma, right? Or something, and so that's the kind of the sense of, the impetus of, boy, samsara is a very difficult place.
Mm.
And it's worth doing what we can to find a way to end this process of getting reborn again.
Great. And we have a question here for Ayasoma. This one says, what is meant by there is karma that is neither dark nor bright, with neither dark nor bright result, leading to the ending of karma? And there's also a sutta reference here, which is great. It's always nice to have the sutta reference. Ayasoma?
Well, we have 2 minutes, so I think it's good that you give long story short.
Long story short, bright karma is karma that has ordinary pleasant results. Dark karma is karma that has ordinary unpleasant results. The karma that leads to the end of karma is the relinquishment of self-identity. Okay. And just briefly, Van Hong mentions, responding to Tanjagro, yes, what Ayasoma said about pervasive wrong view, even among monastics towards oppressed communities. Same thinking that earthquake victims committed bad karma together.
Bapu was saying these things. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So I mean, again, as mentioned, there's karma is a very complex topic, and speculating about past lives is not particularly useful. And instead, again, focusing on teaching people to make good karma in this life seems much more important than speculating about what you did in a past life that meant you were an earthquake victim in this life. It's kind of beside the point. More on the point is, how can you make good karma in this life? It's a much more relevant point. And last question, Cameron asks, maybe the best place to come from is, what is the best karma I can generate in this situation, in this moment, based on what I know to be kusala? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's 3 yeses, so I think that's not likely to be accurate. And that's the last of the questions and the end of our time together, so we'll go ahead and conclude with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.